Why don't we get started? So welcome everybody. This panel is on imperialism and the neoliberal state in the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa. It's sponsored by the South Asia Solidarity Initiative and the Marxist Reading Group at the Bikini Graduate Center. And so I'd like to start just by introducing our panelists. As the panel has changed somewhat since the program was published. So to start out, our first speaker is going to be Ahilan Kadirgamar. He will be speaking on state, regime, and imperialism in Sri Lanka. Our second speaker will be Samar Al-Bulushi, and she will speak on the role of the UN in state building and counter-piracy in Kenya and Somalia. And then our final speaker will be Yunus Jalil, who will be speaking on left politics in Turkey. And I'm Neoliberal, I'll be facilitating the conversation. I'll start just by saying a few brief words, touching on some of the themes that we've been thinking about as we put together this panel. And also just to pose some questions which we can hopefully return to during the discussion. And then each of our speakers will speak, and then we're going to try to leave about an hour for discussion, so we can hopefully get some good conversation going. Okay, so to start, the term neoliberalism is often used today as a synonym for contemporary capitalism. Now, this can be a very useful strategy in terms of being able to connect and give coherence to what would otherwise seem somewhat disparate processes. But the danger with this is that there comes a point where the concept can become so expanded that it may obscure an understanding of the complexity of certain social formation. And so, for example, there's probably general agreement that what this term is being used to describe is something that emerged in our world system starting in the late 1970s. And of course, a lot has happened since then, and particularly in the last few years, to the point where some have said that neoliberalism today is dominant but dead. And so part of our task today is to try to identify how we can use this term concretely to make sense of the social formations as we see them around the world. So I'll talk a little bit about the neoliberal state, because that's, I think, the kind of central concept that we're going to be speaking about. And so I'll say a little bit about that. In an age of globalized finance, there is competition between cities, regions, and nation-states to draw in itinerant surplus capital. The threat of capital flight, or the promise of foreign investment, undergirds the priorities of state agendas at all scales of governance. The imperative of capital to find new outlets for accumulation is manifest today as an imperative for localities to set the terms for their own dispossession. While this may be a description for both New York City or Colombo, for example, one of the questions we may want to consider here is, what kinds of distinctions can we draw between the neoliberal state in the global south and the neoliberal state in the metropole? Or to put this in slightly different terms, how does one's position in the interstate order have a bearing on one's relation to globalized finance? So that's the kind of question we might want to think about today. So now this leads to the kind of second major theme of this panel, which is imperialism still a useful concept today? In other words, are there aspects of our world today that this concept may help to make visible, particularly if we want to distinguish it from the idea of neoliberalism? And if so, how are we to understand it? And in terms of this, I just want to say that imperialism today is very different than from the time of, let's say, when Lenin was writing about it during the early 20th century. In no small part because of the emergence of neoliberalism itself. And I don't want to enumerate the differences between our time and his, but the question I do want to pose is, who are the beneficiaries of of imperialism today? Who are the beneficiaries of imperialism today? Lenin, writing about interstate rivalries in 1916, observed that a privileged section of labor in advanced capitalist countries were able to secure some of the surplus value that was being appropriated from the colonies. This continued in the post-World War II period when unionized labor in the US, for example, shared in the benefits of the US global empire. Now, this, however, has changed somewhat since the advent of neoliberalism, when the privileged position of the working class in advanced capitalist states has been under attack. This is kind of the story that we know from our understanding of neoliberalism. Instead, what we've witnessed is the rise of a globalized financial elite reaping the benefits of open markets and cheap labor. So the question is, if we want to connect this to an understanding of imperialism, to what extent are sections of this emergent global class, this emergent class of globalized financial elite, shaped by their ties to specific nation states, or to their specific position within an interstate order? In short, how is global finance connected to imperialism? Okay, and I'll just say briefly some kinds of questions that we might want to ask in relation to these two themes. So the first is the question of entwinement. Both how are neoliberalism and imperialism entwined themselves in concrete historical formations, but also more importantly, how do they relate to certain social relations which are not entirely within the terms of capitalism. And so I'm thinking here, for example, of inter-ethnic conflicts, fundamentalism or fascism, communal politics, nationalist or populist movements. These are all social formations that are not reducible to either economic relations or entirely encapsulated by capital. And I think one of the things that we see, and hopefully we'll talk about today, is how a lot of these, what we can call traditional relations, can be exacerbated by imperialism or outside intervention by the international community, at the same time as they're used as a scapegoat to entrench neoliberal forms of governance. And so how this entwinement plays out is, I think, central to understanding a lot of what is going on in our world today. The second general question I want to pose is about scales of governance. So neoliberalism, as we probably know, is a concept that operates at multiple scales of governance. We can talk about city policies as being neoliberal. We can talk about the policies of a nation state as being neoliberal. And we can talk about international institutions that implement neoliberal reform. Imperialism, by contrast, is always discussed in terms of the center and periphery of what is now a single world system. So it's discussed on a global scale. The question I would like to pose here is, can we think of imperialism as also operating on certain smaller scales? So not tied to kind of questions of that exist on the order of the entire world system. One example that comes to mind is the contemporary role of Turkey in Africa. So, we can say that Turkey is not necessarily an imperialist power considered at the level of the entire world system, but of course, as we know, Turkey today is making a lot of building up economic ties, making land grabs, and trying to gain control of mineral resources throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Are these elements something that we can encapsulate under the concept of imperialism, or does imperialism help us to understand what's going on here? With this in mind, the next question is, what is entailed in broad-based anti-imperial movements in the global south today? So historically, these movements have taken the form of things like Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, the possibility of delinking regional blocs, such as South Asia as a region. However, as uneven development becomes entrenched throughout the global south, at what point does a strategy for either delinking or some sort of regional solidarity turn into a strategy for a regional power with imperial ambitions to strengthen its control over a territory? One example that comes to mind here is relations between India and Israel that are being developed in terms of not people-to-people solidarity, but an increase in military ties between these two states. And this particular example is also complicated, of course, by the fact that both states see their position as being a front line in the US-led global war on terror. So imperialism in a very strong sense. All of this leads us to what I will leave as my final question, which is, how do we on the US left, sitting here in New York, take an anti-imperialist position with respect to all of these things that are happening, without unwittingly lending support to what may be repressive or authoritarian regimes elsewhere? So I'll leave it at that, and now we'll hear from our panelists, and then we can kind of open it up for discussion. So once again, first we'll have Ahilan speaking on state, regime, and imperialism in Sri Lanka.
Okay, so as it always happens at the left forum, I'm just going to, in 10 minutes, try to kind of summarize what's going on in Sri Lanka in relation to this issue, right? So it's going to be kind of a very quick summation of this kind of long arc of what's going on in Sri Lanka. India comes into the picture, but I think there are also a number of activists from South Asia Solidarity Initiative, which I'm part of, who are here. So we can take that into the discussion, because I think we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So we'll focus more on India during the discussion. Yeah. So if you have questions, do save them, and particularly on India, for the discussion. So looking at Sri Lanka, and it's interesting, if you Sri Lanka, for those of you who don't know, it's that small island south of India in the Indian Ocean. Even though within Sri Lanka we talk of the national economy of Sri Lanka, we talk about different regimes that have come to power, the different states that the history of the post-colonial state, but particularly for Sri Lanka, I think it's true for other countries too, not just Sri Lanka, that global changes impact Sri Lanka much more than people account for, right? Whether it's the anti-colonial movements and decolonization, whether it's the long downturn starting with the oil crisis and so on in the 1970s, or the global war on terror. So it's very hard to think of Sri Lankan politics without having a sense of imperialism or global changes and global hegemony. So Sri Lanka, like many other countries in the colonial world, gained its independence from Britain in 1948. And from 1948 to 1977, what was unique in Sri Lanka was that approximately every 6 years, we had a change of regime, right? From left of center to the right. It was like a pendulum every 6 years swinging. So when the British left, they left behind a very pro-Western rightist regime in power. But 8 years later, it was power was shifted to a left of center, more pro-Soviet Union leaning populist regime. Then again, in 1960 there was a change, 65 to 1970 again, a shift much more to the right, 70 to 77 again, what they call the United Front government, which even changed the name of Sri Lanka to the Republic of Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka. So there's always been this shift. But 1977 becomes a watershed mark when a very pro-US right-wing government came to power, and with that initiated neoliberal reforms in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka being one of the first in South Asia, if not in the global South as well, very similar to what was going on in Egypt at that time, moved towards a neoliberal regime. And this, so I always make a distinction, and if you read Marx's 18th Brumaire, he also makes this distinction between regime and state, right? They have, the state is an important actor anywhere in the world, and I think the claim that we are making is that even in this kind of age of globalization, these states continue to be extremely important, both the state at the level of the US as well as the state at the level of a small country like Sri Lanka. But different regimes control the state, and depending on what regime it is, what politics it is, it makes a difference. And I think we have to be always attuned to that. It doesn't mean that the state goes away, but there is a difference, and I would argue, between the Bush regime and the Obama regime, right? It doesn't mean that the US is no longer an imperialist power, but there is a difference. And that same thing is true of Sri Lanka. So in 1977, the J.R. Jayawardena regime comes to power. For short, I'll call it the J.R. regime. And they go much more in the direction, much closer to the US. And they open the economy, neoliberal reforms take place. They also decide to crush labor. And in order to crush labor, and this goes to Neil's question about communal politics, they kind of fan the flames of singular nationalism further, right? So anti-Tamil pogroms take place, and and a certain armed insurgency begins. So while these neoliberal reforms are going on, then India at that time was much more in the pro-Soviet camp. They decide to support Tamil insurgency. So the history of Sri Lanka, like so many other parts during the Cold War, is also a history of a proxy war being fought between pro-US actors and the pro-Soviet actors. We can get into the history of Bandung and non-alignment during the Q&A if to kind of contextualize that. So this war gains momentum. By 1983, it's a civil war. It continues until 2009. In between, there's a major insurgency in the south, where Sinhalese youth also take up the state. So it's not just the Tamils against the Sinhalese as it's popularly known here, right? It's much more complicated. And over the course of those 25 years, I would say anywhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people die in this civil war and this insurgency. So this is kind of, so when we're thinking of imperialism and neoliberalism, this is kind of the cost of it, right? Of what happens even in a small country. 200,000 people for a country with a population of 20 million now, that's a huge chunk of a population who've been killed. I mean, I'm not imagining the people who are maimed, injured, people who have been, widowed. So it's the kind of devastation that comes with it. And neoliberalism was supposed to be something that would push forward the economy, but even the World Bank claims that Sri Lanka's GDP now, if you're only looking at it in terms of those, that limited notion of GDP and growth, it's half what it would have been if not for the civil war. In 2009, the war comes to an end, a very brutal, catastrophic end. Many actors estimate the number of deaths in the last few months of the war to be, anywhere between 20,000 to 40,000 people. That's what the UN's estimates are. It comes to a catastrophic end with the LTT, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil was fighting on behalf of the Tamil population. And it's important to be clear here that they are no emancipatory actor, right? I characterize their politics as also of a brand of fascist politics, and they decimated the left within the Tamil polity, fighting a very authoritarian regime in power, the Rajapaksa regime, which was the last regime in power. It comes to a catastrophic end with the decimation of the LTT, tremendous civilian cost. And but the LTT was a very pyramidal structure, a very militarized structure. So once the leadership was decimated, I don't think there's any chance of the insurgency as such reviving. But what happens after the end of the war? The Rajapaksa regime decides to push forward what I've characterized as a second wave of neoliberalism. Now the war is over. The entire country is under the control of the state. So there is a merging of security and economic development, but economic development was going to be pushed through neoliberal reform. So they invite global finance capital to come in. There is this much euphoria about the Sri Lankan economy soon after 2009. Our stock market quadruples, right? So if you put $100 into the stock market, 2 years later you would have had $400. This is what is another characteristic of global finance, these kind of bubbles and the way in which there is euphoria. So that lasts for about a year and a half, 2 years. But the state remains very repressive. The north and east of the country remains militarized. And there are certain noises by some actors about the need to also address what happened during the war. What do you do with the Tamil minority? Will there be some kind of a political settlement to address their grievances that have always been there even prior to the Civil War? So in this kind of very fast story that I'm taking you through, now we come to the last few months, 2012, and things have again kind of are in the limelight in terms of Sri Lanka. I want to kind of think of 3 forms of pressures at work on Sri Lanka right now. One is India has always been a very dominant regional actor. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, they helped the kind of armed insurgency come to in the 1980s, but they take a different line when the LTT decides to fight the Indian army in the 1987s when there was Indian peacekeeping forces, and the LTT eventually also assassinated former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, right? So India had played a very supportive role of the Sri Lankan state during the latter half of the war. But India has always pushed for some kind of a political settlement, right, through constitutional reform, devolution of power to the regions where the Tamils are a minority. So that's pressure continues. Now they are calling for some kind of constitutional reform to address the grievances of the Tamil minority. So that's one form of pressure. The US and Western countries, I think there is dialogue with India on this issue, but they have been focusing on accountability and possible attention on war crimes in Sri Lanka during towards the end of the war. And next week, the US has tabled a resolution against Sri Lanka at the UN Human Rights Council. This is a big deal. The only resolution that was passed on Sri Lanka was way back in the 1980s when India was pushing for one, and they used Argentina as a proxy to push through that resolution. The UN Human Rights Council is very different from the Security Council. I can kind of give you the differences. There are 47 members. It's not assured that the US will get a majority on this resolution, so Sri Lanka is mobilizing against that because there is quite a bit of representation of Asian, African, Islamic countries there, and European countries are only about 8 of those 47 members. But US has many other ways of getting support for it. There's kind of a horse trading that goes on, right, at the UN Human Rights Council. So they are pushing some kind of censure against Sri Lanka. So that's another form of pressure. But the third form of pressure is very different, and that's the kind of fallout of this neoliberal policies. Over the last 2 months, there have been massive protests in Sri Lanka. The price of petrol, diesel, and kerosene in particular. Kerosene is what people in the rural areas use to light lamps, for use for cooking, and so on. The price of kerosene in Sri Lanka went up by 50% in one day. They raised the price of it. So there's been massive protests by the fisher folk, by farmers against, and this is a fallout of a balance of payment problem that is coming out. Because even though, as I mentioned earlier, there was this stock market bubble, with the euro crisis and capital flight from the emerging markets, Sri Lanka is now finding that the very same thing that was kind of creating this boom of a Sri Lankan economy for 2 years, now is causing a crisis, right? So these 3 forms of pressures are taking place. And the kind of protest that we've seen in Sri Lanka, we haven't seen for 30 years during the Civil War. Because during a war, everything is polarized. You can go back to Lenin talking about what happens to during the First World War, right? Because war has a way of the different actors getting polarized and working class struggles getting suppressed. And this even happens on a small scale in a country like Sri Lanka. So it's protests that we haven't seen on this scale. But the question I want to leave you with is, why is it that maybe from our vantage point, from New York or London, or that much of the attention might go on forms of constitutional change or the war crimes issue? There was a major documentary, the second one launched, I'm not sure if you've heard about it, by Channel 4 in the UK on the war crimes issue in Sri Lanka. And even the US and the Western powers taking up the war crimes issue, right? Attention goes there because of the way in which the media frames the issue of Sri Lanka. And why is it that we can't think of the issues of the struggles that are coming up from the ground, and how do we see that in relation to the question of imperialism and the neoliberal state? But I don't want to take too much time, so I'll stop there, but we'll come back to, I think, the larger question of imperialism and the neoliberal state.
Great. Okay, so our next speaker, Samar Al-Bulushi, will be talking about the role of the UN in state building and counter-piracy in Kenya and Somalia.
Does anyone want to come and sit up here? Is it okay? All right, so I'm going to be looking at, as Neil mentioned, the issue of maritime piracy off the coast of East Africa. And here I'm especially interested in what is classified as criminal and illegal behavior and what is not. You have, over the last several years, Somalis responding to toxic waste dumping and illegal fishing off of the coast of their country. Both of these activities have destroyed their livelihoods, and despite numerous appeals to the United Nations on these issues, it's only the phenomenon of the hijack for ransom piracy that has garnered attention and demanded response from the UN. And the UN, of course, as an ostensibly neutral international body, is and has been crucial to both defining the problem and crafting a legitimate, so-called legitimate response. So I'm going to look both at the UN in general and how it's responded, and at the role of both Kenya and Somalia in this process, and suggest that the UN's role in the response provides some insights into its relationship to the global economy. So of course we have a discourse of panic and alarm in response to Somali piracy, demanding an international response. We're told that piracy threatens the distribution of global oil, and thereby it threatens the global economy as a whole. We're told that piracy costs anywhere between $8 and $12 billion a year to the economy, without any explanation of what that cost actually entails. And we're also told that piracy is the consequence of so-called state failure in Somalia, that it's a consequence of lawlessness, criminality, etc., that must be put in check by state-building initiatives. And in light of the range of actors that the UN has now mobilized in response to piracy, I think we absolutely have to consider how the term piracy itself plays into the spectacle of banditry and lawlessness. So on the one hand, while the terminology used in reference to those whose job is to counter piracy is associated with rationality, neutrality, order, etc., the pirates, of course, themselves are illegal criminals. And despite the fact that violence may be employed by both sets of actors, the language used assumes that only one group is engaged in criminal behavior, contributing to a broader spectacle of the economy itself as orderly and peaceful, as contrasted with those who create disorder by disrupting its so-called normal and legitimate functioning. And there's a great quote to draw from there from the International Maritime Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations, which describes piracy and armed robbery against ships as constituting real and ever-present dangers to those who use the seas for peaceful purposes. So all of these representations have paid off. Counter-piracy initiatives now constitute a multi-billion-dollar industry. The UN works with a whole range of actors, from transnational firms some of which have been hired to monitor donor aid provided to the transitional federal government in Somalia, to the Kenyan state, which has taken on the project of prosecuting pirates, to private security contractors, to the World Bank. Each of these actors employ techniques that are designed to regulate the movement of people and ensure the free flow of capital. So in this context, the ungoverned space, the idea of ungoverned space is actually a site of opportunity and site of profit for sometimes competing and sometimes cooperating actors, which complicates our understanding of state-building agendas, which try to create very fine and distinguished lines between what constitutes legal behavior, illegal behavior, what constitutes order and disorder, that type of thing. So Kenya's role in this context, looking back at the last 10, 11 years, Kenya has been a key ally of the West in the global war on terror. They saw an opportunity post 9/11 to solidify its position as an ally. And in the post-2007 election crisis in Kenya, you had, I think the hypocrisy of the international community became quite evident as it emphasized police and military reforms within Kenya as necessary to restoring public trust in the state security apparatus and as a so-called democratizing force, and at the same time ignoring Kenya's role in the war on terror and the fact that Kenya has simultaneously expanded its use of state and non-state agents who operate in an unregulated context outside the scrutiny of the rule of law. And the last few years, of course, counter-piracy has presented further opportunities for the Kenyan government. As mentioned just briefly earlier, they have agreed in exchange for a substantial amount of international aid to try Somali pirates in Kenyan courts. And they have done this despite the fact that this has presented problems both of jurisdiction and of apprehension. You know, they don't technically have the grounds to be trying these pirates in Kenyan courts. It doesn't fall within the jurisdiction, but that is one thing that the international community has chosen to overlook. And the US and other navies have also graciously done the apprehending for them and brought them to the Kenyan courts. They've also received money to securitize their ports in a joint project between the World Bank and the US Department of Homeland Security. They signed a $20 million contract with an Israeli security firm to protect the Mombasa port. And what you see happening is a direct connection made between Kenyan officials, the Kenyan officials are making a direct connection between security and economic growth. So the Ministry of Trade, for example, sees these securitization programs as important to improving opportunities for investment. And a very concrete example of this is the country's latest development plan called Vision 2030, which itself was done in cooperation with the financial firm McKinsey, which, as far as I know, also helped put together a plan for the Indian government for Mumbai, called Vision Mumbai. And in this Vision 2030, you have security as a key pillar. This is ostensibly a plan about economic growth, but security is a pillar. The overall ambition for the security sector under Vision 2030 is a society free from danger and fear. But I do think it's important not to create the impression that the Kenyan state is simply a monolith with unified interests in privatization, centralization, etc., because the Kenyan economy has, at the same time, benefited from the pirate economy, from the informal economy, and has for years, just by virtue of informal trade networks between Kenya and Somalia. So it's not necessarily a clear picture one way or another. On the role of Somalia, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime has played a prominent role identifying maritime piracy as organized crime. And this UN agency has focused on a couple of things. One, the trying and imprisonment of Somali pirates, as I mentioned earlier. Second, reaching out to the Somali diaspora. And third, strangling the financial arm of the pirate economy, which of course provides the basis for criminalizing the informal economy and demanding a centralized private economy. Since I've touched on the trials, the outreach to Somali diaspora presents an opportunity to cultivate neoliberal subjects. In partnership with the UN, they're encouraged to invest in designated projects and to highlight to fellow members of the Somali community positive career alternatives to piracy, including quote-unquote exciting, successful economic ventures and skills training. This is coming directly from a communication strategy that the UN put out for Somalia beyond piracy. So while we may think of this particular arm of the UN, Office on Drugs and Crime, as purely engaged in the realm of law, it is at the same time heavily engaged in efforts to monitor and restructure the Somali economy and to identify the right partners for this endeavor. And of particular concern to the UN is the Hawala money transfer and banking system that is key to the movement of goods and capital in the region. But because it functions outside the scope of state regulation, it's scrutinized by international actors and characterized in these circles as illegal and illegitimate. And of course, the UN justifies the pushing for formalization and centralization in the name of the rule of law, good governance, etc. The irony, however, is that the international aid industry itself depends heavily on this informal banking system for its own, in order to pay its own staff, in order to get goods in and out of Somalia. So this also sheds light on the complexity and potentially competing interests within the UN system. The final two examples that I just want to quickly touch on of the UN's activities in counter-piracy. The first is what they're calling a trust fund to support initiatives of states countering piracy off the coast of Somalia. This is a public-private partnership contributing to the idea that African problems require market solutions. The trust fund brochure offers private individuals and corporate entities the chance to invest in the deterrence and prosecution of pirates. Another section of the brochure highlights an expedited facility for the prosecution and detention of pirates, and I'm just going to quote briefly here from the brochure. It says that this provides financial support for urgent, time-sensitive initiatives which ensure that administrative processes, such as prosecution and detention of piracy suspects, remain functioning and uncompromised. The expedited facility can be used for governments, the private sector, and other stakeholders to reimburse the cost of participating in regional piracy trials, including the travel of key witnesses. So the language used here to describe this facility similarly reflects a corporate approach in which justice is something that's delivered in a timely fashion. And yet, nowhere in the brochure do we have any mention of justice, yet alone any mention of the law. The focus is simply on efficiency. The second example is coming back to the International Maritime Organization. Again, a UN agency which recently issued guidelines on the use of privately contracted armed security personnel. And they issued these guidelines for instances if and when a flag state determines that such a measure would be appropriate and lawful. And here, I mean, we get into the murky terrain of flag states in which the lines between, on questions of accountability, sovereign accountability, become very blurred. The International Maritime Organization appears to grant these states ad hoc authority to determine what constitutes lawful activity. And the fact that the UN condones and even encourages the use of private security companies is indicative of its place in the military commercial complex, despite its repeated emphasis on the rule of law and the exact nature of services provided by the private security industry. The nature of the services provided by the private security industry, as we know, is nebulous and often extends outside the scope of the law. So just a couple concluding thoughts. I think it's worth thinking about what a historical examination of maritime trade might reveal about the evolution of international law in relation to modern capitalism. And then to think about whether or not we can still rely on international law as a source of support in our struggles for justice.
Great. So our final speaker is Yunus Talil, speaking on left politics of Turkey.
Well, I'm a later addition to the panel, so please accept my apologies that I won't be able to, I guess, provide a, like a sufficient presentation like my friends' presentations did. So I should start with, I guess, I think how do we define imperialism? Before starting to, I guess, to think about like what kind of like precise like definition we can come up with. I think we should also look at how people use the term and kind of the place and the role of the concept of imperialism and, you know, relevant notions and relevant terms in popular moments vocabulary. And I think in Turkey I think let me start with this. I guess in Turkey, like in like discussions, when I have discussions with my friends, it's when you use the term imperialism, it's always you have to explain many things because it's kind of like an outdated word. Like it's kind of delegitimized in a sense because of, I guess, like this. This turn Turkey has gone through towards like kind of a liberalization of political culture. So in a sense, and also I guess I guess another problem is the critique of neoliberalism in Turkey is also very much like divided among like different factions. I think three major groups I can say. I guess one is a like pro-nationalist leftist tendency that relies on, I guess, like a developmentalist perspective, and also relying on the, I guess, distinction between, you know, productive capital and financial capital. That's I think the one tendency, and the other is, and since this group is mainly associated with nationalist ideologies, and also, you know, pro-state tendencies and the support for the state against its war, you know, support for Turkish state's war against the Kurdish guerrillas. So it's like a, I guess like a, this group, I think the developmentalist and nationalist perspective is mainly associated with the pro-state perspective. And the second group is more liberal leftist group that's like, you know, like prioritizing the, you know, political reforms, kind of making, you know, like relying on the distinction between political liberalism and economic liberalism, and favoring political liberalism, and in that sense actually kind of aligning with the current government's policies. So that's the second group. And I guess also there's this like nebula of like people who cannot like, you know, locate themselves between those two tendencies, who like try to like come up with like a more like you know, anti-nationalist perspective, critical of the state, but also do not want to like support the, do not want to support the current government's like liberalization, and kind of trying to, and also critical of the current government's liberal policies. So in a sense, I think the word imperialism is used, I guess, like the in Turkey's, it has this kind of like the kind of like baggage behind it. In a sense, like the imperialism is associated with developmentalist and nationalist perspectives, and anyone who uses it is, you know, you may be like, you know, labeled as such, and so I guess like the, you know, like I guess like that's like one aspect, like we should pay attention to like the why like the concept of imperialism, the value of the concept, I think, you know, also depends on the the kind of like the local histories and the kind of the political cultures in they were used, and with what kind of like positions they are associated. That's, I guess, like one important aspect, and also the about the neoliberalism question. I think it's Turkey provides an interesting case because it's successfully presented as a kind of it's presented as a successful case of neoliberalization in the non-Western world, and it's promoted as such, and that's, I guess, and that's something, that image is used by the current government to kind of to hide, you know, to hide like the kind of what goes under actually this kind of like successful case, and that's, I guess, the kind of the form of state that neoliberalization relies on, and the current government, I guess, also like it is successful in another sense because it could sustain bringing this like neoliberalization policies with an authoritarian form of politics, and it could sustain it in, you know, like true procedural democracy, because, you know, the current government you know, did secure the popular support in the national election. So I think that's also, I guess, like the aspect I would like to highlight, because the discussions of neoliberalism always I guess, like for leftists, the discussion of neoliberalism always seemed kind of like a visible thing, you know, like, and it's easily identifiable. But I think much goes actually into like how, you know, like how the effects of neoliberalism are hidden in international politics is like a big thing, and that's, I guess, like that's why I said like quote-unquote successful case, and that's, I guess, another aspect I wanted to highlight about Turkey, and also one more aspect about the imperialism, the question of imperialism in relation to Turkey. As mentioned before, Turkey has economic and political interests in North Africa and, you know, Africa in general. And I think again what is interesting about these relations, they were always attached to the discourse of kind of like democracy lately. It's kind of like democracy for Turkey as like as the Western power that kind of like provides this like masking of actually the kind of like the economic interest, whether you call it imperialist or not, but the kind of like this supra-territorial relations are, you know, kind of like the interests are always hidden with this kind of like discourse of democracy, and that has become much more clear with after the Arab Spring, because as Arab Spring brought up the question of democracy and the democratization of the region in more general, the current government, Turkish state in general also, presented itself as the the spring itself in a sense. It's like they see themselves at the end of that process. That's why. So in a sense, it's the kind of like it's maybe like similar to the Western discourse on democracy in a sense, like kind of like positing themselves at the end of the teleology, and Turkey again, as a Muslim country, they position themselves at the end of this teleology of democratization. So I think that's another aspect in a sense. I mean, I don't know like where we can go with this, but I think Turkish case provides this like interesting contrast or comparison to the Western, like imperialist ambitions, and also its relation to the democracy discourse, because it's a good case of, I guess, like kind of like having extraterritorial ambitions and also the promotion of democracy and kind of the reliance on democracy discourse. And I think you can.
Okay. Great. So there's a lot on the table right now, and we have about an hour for discussion. What I want to do is just maybe try to pick up some of the threads while people gather their comments or questions. And I'll just start by saying, I think Eunice pointed out very strongly to us that we can't understand concepts like imperialism or neoliberalism without thinking about their specific local histories in particular contexts. And so I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. At the same time, I think one of the things that we are trying to do by bringing together this panel is to be able to draw connections across different regions. So, for example, the importance of the UN, I think you all touched on that in different ways. Whether it's through human rights reports that kind of specify a certain international position with respect to what might be considered domestic affairs, or whether we're talking about international trade law and how that has an impact on coastal economies. So I actually just want to maybe start things off by going in a slightly different direction, which is, all of you brought up this fact that, we see a lot of state repression at the same time as there is, various popular uprisings or revolts. Whether it's Sri Lanka, Somalia, Turkey certainly is, that's been getting media attention. So, we see these processes happening. Underlying this, there's entrenchments of neoliberalism. And, one of the things that kind of strikes me in thinking about your talks is that in many ways these aren't being connected to the kind of global uprisings or global revolts of, let's say, the Arab Spring, or questions related to austerity, whether it's in the US or Europe, so, Occupy movements. And I'm wondering whether you see that there is a connection there, or why that's not being made more fully in terms of the kind of discourse within the left, either in, global media or in places like the US. But if you could just speak to that a little bit, if you could
Yeah. I thought it was very interesting what Yunus said about how in Turkey they were viewing the Arab Spring, right? As that they're already at the end of the process, right? That we've achieved democracy, we don't need the Arab Spring kind of thinking that the regime has, which in Sri Lanka it's slightly different, because just, as I mentioned, the last 2 months we've seen massive protests on the street, and the discourse from the regime, what the regime is saying is, look, we are a democracy, we don't need this kind of stuff, you can always vote another regime into power, we don't need the Arab Spring, right? So there is a certain nervousness, I think, certainly all over the global south, that even if it's, I think in the Middle East it is directly connected, right? It's, I mean, the Arab street kind of, there is connections that one spreads to the other. When it comes to South Asia, I think the ruling regimes are nervous because there has been abject poverty. The last 30 years of neoliberalism has really increased inequalities. And when they see kind of these massive protests in the Middle East and then protests start to rise, the regimes get very nervous, so they're trying to manage it. The one problem I think that we have, unlike previous eras, right? Decolonization versus, during the period of decolonization, anti-colonial struggles spread in the same way. There was, and there was much more solidarity between South Asia and Africa, and even the black movement here for that matter. Or the importance that a kind of an internationalist communist socialist movement provided for that kind of connection, right? The problem I see now is that there isn't that kind of a vision, right, that would easily make those connections. And I think that's, that is a challenge for the left going forward, that we don't have the ideology, the kind of vision to make those connections. But I think there are reverberations. Maybe it will take time for that to, as the crisis deepens, for it to come to fruition.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just say a few things. One, thinking especially about Kenya, I think on the one hand you have the kind of NGOification of struggle. And the NGO industry in Kenya is really large, and I think quite adept at co-opting people. And then outside of that realm, people are incredibly aware of injustice, corruption in particular, but I think see their best kind of way of surviving is to engage in their own informal activity, not necessarily, that there isn't necessarily movement building and connection being made with the occupied.
I think what could Turkey I mean, I guess that many of my friends in Turkey expect actually Turkey would have Kurdish Spring, and that was actually, I mean, it was very much possible because that was a kind of that was kind of like a disillusionment with the government policies and the government's kind of like the pragmatic and kind of like the liberal I mean the pragmatic reformism in a sense, that was that Kurds in the first, I guess, the mid 2000s, that was that was so popular. I mean that the Justice and Development Party, the current government, was carrying this kind of promise of the liberal reforms, and the political reforms could bring up a new phase, and that could actually open up kind of a new political field for Kurds, and Kurds can can adapt to this, they can have more representation, they could have more rights, and but that's that didn't work out because the current government, the Justice and Development Party, wanted the Kurdish movement to accept its own terms. Obviously, they want that was the stakes were high in a sense. I mean, for them, they wanted the consent, and that didn't happen. The Kurdish movement also did want to kind of step in this process through their own terms and kind of with the you know, like not necessarily accepting like a kind of an assimilationist discourse by the government. So that didn't work out, and this like growing disillusionment of Kurdish movement with the current government's like, you know, promises towards liberalization. I think, you know, they propose like some sort of like autonomous political structure actually that caused like so much frustration in government circles, because, you know, that's like they are like founding their own states in a sense, and so that's, you know, that was actually, I guess, like that could easily lead to a Kurdish Spring, but that's, I guess, the interesting thing about the current government also. They, as you know, like they mix this like democracy discourse very well with, you know, like the repressive politics and the you know, like the using state as a kind of like an apparatus like to suppress like, you know, moments, and that's what happened. And especially here, I think the state, especially they criminalize this, you know, this new structure. So they like put, you know, like they arrested, you know, all the members of this like new like political body founded by Kurdish movement, and there's, you know, there are still like, you know, trials going on, and as they also like liberalize the system, you know, the judicial system, they extended the time for what's it called, so they could like arrest like the, you know, for longer times, and the investigation takes longer, and they use that. So in a sense, they you know, they put into prison actually the most active members of the Kurdish movement, and that's, you know, that's, I guess, like what prevented like, you know, Turkey to have like something like Kurdish Spring. So that's one thing. I mean, also, I mean, maybe like later we can talk about labor politics, but I guess that's.
Great. And also, if anyone has comments, I think we can just also take them in batches, so it doesn't have to be just a Q&A. So don't be shy to raise your hand. So we have, yeah, and then in the back. And if you could just say your name so we can.
My name is Yusuf. I'm not sure if you guys know much about the specific economies of various Middle Eastern states, but I'm going to ask anyway. The Mubarak regime and the Ben Ali regime in Tunisia were both obviously neoliberal states, and the revolution against them, I guess, could be seen as a revolution against neoliberalism. But in Gaddafi's Libya and Bashar's Syria, it's a different case. My question is, those two states were both in the process of liberalizing their economies. Do you guys know to what extent has the economy still being controlled by the state in those two countries?
Great.
Me?
Yeah.
My name is Julia. My question is about Turkish left. We know Turkish administration has been oppressive for a long time now, and they really give this illusion that they will open a new way of talk with Kurdish guerrillas, and even they fool some portion of the left that Turkey will be more open-minded and democratic country. But we know how it turned out, that they imprisoned, as Yunus, I believe, addressed that, they imprisoned local Turkish representatives. The number is so high that never happened before in the history of the Turkish Republic. And they imprisoned journalists that I believe this is also like they rank in the third in the world, I believe. So my question is to Yunus, since he knows, I bet, better than me, what is wrong in Turkish left? I mean, how come they can't, for so long, they can't get together to really have this mass movement toward this oppressive administration, which has very strong tie with U.S. I know if that's the case, then it is really hard for regular people in the street to go out and protest and have mass movement. But still, within Turkish left, there are so many conflicts, and I just don't know what is it that preventing them to put all differences aside and really see the big pictures and move on, because most of them are still attached to their national identity, which has been really actually the one of the reasons why Turkish government can be oppressive, because they use identity for to oppress people, as if like either you are with us or you're against us. It is just like Bush said once, that either you're your enemy or you are one of us. So I just really want to have your side, that what do you think what left should do in Turkey, or what is it that they are not doing to put their power together to have a mass movement just like in Middle East?
Should we start with those two? Maybe one more, yeah.
That's a question for Ahilan. You said that till 1977 there were different governments which had a component of left in Sri Lanka, and after that things changed. My question is, what is the current situation of the Sri Lankan left, and is it because of like this regime that you've had so far and these wars? First of all, there hasn't been, say, oppression of grassroots movements, or has there been like any kind of left building up? What's the current situation?
To add to that last question, you were talking a little bit, or as I understood it, that the U.S. and the UN have sort of been pushing for a censure for war crimes against the Sri Lankan government. And I would ask, what is the left's position about that, and do they see in Sri Lanka, like, do they see the economic crisis as being sort of more important and relevant? And what is the legacy of the war and the things that happened during the war and affecting like the current economic situation?
Why don't we just take those and then we'll get to one.
So maybe I'll start. I'm not sure I can. And also, doesn't have to be a Q&A. We can, I think, make it much more of an open discussion, because we're also trying to think through these questions with all of you. So it's not like we have the answers. So, but this question of the state of neoliberalism and Syria and Libya, I mean, I don't know too much about that, right? But I think the one point I can say is that it seems to me that imperialism works in two major ways, right? And since we're talking about imperialism, one in the last 30 years has been through the use of global finance to take forward neoliberalism, right? So even in Egypt now, even though the Mubarak regime has been overthrown, they are trying to negotiate a deal with the IMF, right? Which will come with conditionalities. So there will constantly be pressures to take neoliberalism further. But in the case of Libya in particular, my sense is the other aspect of imperialism is also rent-seeking, right? So that after decolonization throughout the global south, there was attempts to go and grab resources, right? I'm sure Siddharth could talk about what's happened, or Neil can, in terms of even now in India, that mining, for example, right? Or you take oil or mine, so that you attempt to exploit the resource-rich regions of the global south. So they also wanted a regime change in Libya, and by the way, Gaddafi was looking to go the neoliberal route, right? We know about his son having that good connection with LSE and so on, but there is also both things. So, and I think that's the kind of the complexity of neoliberalism at imperialism at one level, right? They're trying to push through neoliberalism, but there's also rent-seeking. And this question on the Turkish left, and I've been thinking, quite a bit as Yunus has been talking, or many of my other Turkish friends, it's very, I hate to use similar because each context is so different, but in Sri Lanka it was the Tamil question, like the Kurdish question, right? and the decimation of the LTT and Tamil militancy, not just in Turkey. My friends tell me that they always talk about the Sri Lanka solution now, right? Or in Pakistan, they talk about the Sri Lanka solution, that there is a way in which, through sheer brutality and repression, they think that they can wipe out any kind of insurgency or call for autonomy, right? And which is very worrying. I think the LTT was a very particular kind of organization, as I mentioned. It was very pyramidal in structure, where it worked, and even there, it worked at huge cost to the civilian population, right? But this kind of the state's mindset, and this came with the war on terror, right? This mindset. So as much as there is a resolution against Sri Lanka by the US, not too long ago, in 2007, the US Undersecretary for State said Sri Lanka is an unconditional friend of the United States, right? So we see how things change in a very short period of time. Now they won't do that, they won't make that same mistake if Sri Lanka was geopolitically important, right? But Sri Lanka isn't, so one day they say it's an unconditional friend, now they're calling for censure. So that's the uniqueness of imperialist power. They can be for human rights, and they can be for massive repression, right? And both, often at the same time. And that's why I think these instances are important. And I was thinking of Samar's presentation. I'm trying also to kind of bring, we are looking at very different contexts across the globe, but there are so many parallels, right? So what Samar was saying about the way in which maritime law gets used, right? And there's the importance of, you take a place like India, it is of geopolitical importance, right? The US, India, and I would say the axis of US, Israel, and India, which has become so much stronger in the last 10 years. India is of geopolitical importance. US sees that as a strong ally in its kind of rivalry with China, right? Whether we characterize as Chinese imperialism or not, but there's certainly rivalry, and it's playing out in Sri Lanka, right? India and China are playing out. But so countries like India of geopolitical importance, there's still, I think, importance to, for the left to look for what's going on in places like Sri Lanka or Somalia, because a lot of the experimentation happens, right? It may not be of geopolitical importance on the scale that India is. So during the kind of the height of the war in Sri Lanka, or before that, even the peace process that was attempted, there was a lot of experimentation with US backing on conflict resolution in Sri Lanka. And that was the other side of the war on terror. Or we might say that the war on terror, it was against, on the one hand, they were pushing the war on terror against the tigers in Sri Lanka. At the same time, they were characterizing, okay, if Sri Lanka doesn't come to some kind of resolution, it's a failed state. So this language of failed states, and why states are so important in this age of globalization, right? People tend to think, with globalization, the states don't matter, but states matter. Even if it's a small state, it matters, and it's because repression is important for neoliberalism, like Yunus is talking about. So on the current state of the left and what's the left's position, and this is the kind of the sad state of affairs in the global south. The traditional left is in, all three major left parties in Sri Lanka are in the coalition government with Rajapaksa, right? This very repressive right-wing regime that has been so much against the minorities. The left are in coalition with them. They feel uncomfortable, but they're there for whatever perks they get out of it, right? They've been bought over. And I think that's important. And this is where, the local context and the language that Yunus was talking about. The current Sri Lankan government, if you read their budget speech, or you listen to the president speak, he uses the language of anti-imperialism, right? That's the way in which he uses it. And he even says that he's against neoliberalism. I mean, last year's budget, if you say, very clearly. But then I would characterize them as really taking forward neoliberalism, right? There's a complete disconnect between the language that these regimes use and the policies that they do. So he's anti-imperialist, but he's inviting global finance capital. For me, that is the biggest pillar of imperialism, is global finance capital. So, and sometimes people fall for that, right? So, and particularly in terms of how we receive it. So, I'm a big fan of Naomi Klein, but in her book, Shock Doctrine, she talks about the anti-neoliberal regime of Rajapaksa because that's how, at first sight, it seems like, right? So from a distance, and that's why it's all the more important to kind of pay attention carefully to what's the underlying politics. And it's much more harder when we don't have that kind of a global kind of left internationalist solidarity through which we can get these. And what has, so given that the left has been kind of bought over by the government, you know, even with these current protests, they are kind of realize that the protests are important, but they can't come out openly because they want to be in the government. And when it comes to this whole war crimes issue, they're calling it an imperialist intervention, right? There's very comfortable language, the kind of left language of anti-imperialism without kind of really laying it out. So that's why I think in sometimes we need to kind of, it's important to have a much stronger open debate on what imperialism is so that these kind of opportunist actors don't take away the language of anti-imperialism or anti-colonial or and to be, you know, clear on the issue of what happened at the end of the war. My own position is that there needs to be an accounting for what happened at the end of the war, right? It's just because the U.S. is putting forward a resolution and it's the UN Human Rights Council, I'm not going to right away have a knee-jerk opposition to it, right? I think, you know, as problematic as the UN is, you know, sometimes the UN mechanism has to also play out. It's a very complicated issue, you know. I'm opposed to what the US does in many things, but on this particular resolution, it's asking the Sri Lankan government to implement its own commission's recommendations. I think, you know, it will be a good thing that if the resolution passes, but often that's not the end of the story, right? The resolution will come with strings attached, right? There's other ways in which the situation will get internationalized. For me, in all of this, how can we be in solidarity with local movements, right? That's ultimately the important issue, that if we work in isolation from here by looking at the media and we are not in solidarity, so we have to find ways in which to be in solidarity with progressive movements. And it's all the more harder because a lot of the left actors who are traditionally left, right, have been bought over by these regimes. So how can we have to identify new progressive movements and find ways in which to be in solidarity with them?
I think about the one thing about the Syrian economy and the way economy is organized, and that how that actually like affects the kind of the internal politics in Syria. I think in Syria there's like, in comparison to many other states in the region, they still rely on, not now maybe, but I mean they have relied more on actual kind of a redistributive system, and that makes, I think, that has made a huge difference. I mean, in terms of appropriating the consent of the of different classes in Syria. And they actually, they didn't only tie, I mean, this strategy not only didn't only work for appropriating the consent of popular classes, but also the trading classes, like the merchant classes in the northern part of the country. And that's, I guess, I think that's one of the reasons why, like, Syria could have actually resisted this far, I mean, to the kind of like, so I mean, I don't know what is happening actually. I have like so much like questions about what is happening, and there's so much misinformation, you know, about what is happening. But I guess like that's the crucial issue. They had the kind of like I mean, they liberalized many economies. And we know that they, like they cooperated with the German investment banks and things like that. But still, they had that actual, like, much more like old style, like, redistributive system, and that actually produced so much legitimacy, I think. And that they didn't only do this, like, as always like presented, I guess that's the problem. They didn't do this across sectarian lines, and we know that actually like the Sunni and Alawite populations benefited from this redistributive system. So that's what I know about Syrian economy, and what I understand, that's changing. And if the NATO and all these Western powers and Turkey and all these other players establish a humanitarian corridor, they will possibly bring it to the far that they could actually they could because let me put this way actually. So since the support of merchant classes in the south is very crucial, I think like when they establish the humanitarian corridor, they will extend it to include these like cities, and then that will actually like cut the support of merchant classes in this in the north. I'm sorry, I'm saying south, but it's north. I'm sorry. And that will I guess like that's a possibility, I guess, like that might happen like with possible occupation of Syria. And about left, Turkish left. It's a really difficult question. Also I think the left, it has been, I guess, like of course, like it's a very important question, but also the effectiveness of the left in Turkey is very limited. Not even they are united. I think like it's not like a big power, and it has lost that like the transformative power. I think, and the numbers are like has decreased a lot. I think, and it's good or bad, but that I think like shows us that neoliberalism or these transformations actually has brought up a new landscape of like it has brought up like this the question of what should be the object of leftist politics. So in a sense, like it's not like and I think as we have seen actually in the union demonstrations, the number of like the kind of like leftist led like the sectors are lacking. Actually like it's like much more like spontaneous like worker demonstrations happening, and also that happens also in the rural areas. That's like it's in a sense like there is unrest in the country. Obviously there's discontent, but it's not always connected to the left. Left as we can like say as like left. I think that's like in a sense the kind of the I think there's like major transformations of neoliberalism has brought this like new geography of actual like resistance and dissidence and kind of like possible uprisings. So and what I think is Turkish left, and also I think like globally speaking, leftists in general hasn't yet come up with like the kind of terminology and the style of organization, the style of relating to these groups. And my like for instance like when there was you may remember I think when there was this like demonstration in Ankara, in the capital city, by the state workers, like the leftists actually they didn't try to lead the kind of like this like demonstration and kind of like this movement. They instead actually like just like was there to kind of like to help them, with like, logistics and things like that. And my understanding is actually in younger generations of leftist parties and organizations, they are learning this new way of actually relating to the masses, and that actually like brings up this like interesting point, because most of these people actually demonstrating in Ankara, they were conservative people. They voted for the current government, so they were actually like they were they didn't have the actual the class consciousness and the kind of like mapping out the system. But I think like what happened like 2 years ago in that demonstration, people like the leftist groups like kind of like encounter with this like problem, like how to kind of like how like I mean also of course like it's given that all these leftist groups are secularists, they value secular ideology and things like that, and you have this like mass mobilization whose members are like mostly religiously observant, and like you have these questions, and I think like through time, I mean the left, like the leftist parties will will develop like new sensibilities like towards actually this kind of like towards masses in Turkey, and I think, and then they could move towards this like statement. I mean they could move, I guess, like towards actually like building like I think they could grow in numbers as they do relate to the masses in new ways. I think that's my
Can I say something? Well, now you said that it actually occurred to me that left, or majority of the left in Turkey, hasn't been able to capture, enhance their view to capture everyone's need. For instance, if I know that movement, and by a coincidence I was there in Ankara and I saw their tents and how they lived, it was just incredible. But it's just that there was no leftist group that I saw that they support them, because if you are leftist in Turkey, that means you have to be secularist, and if you are a little bit conservative or religious, they may not get along with you. Further than that, some people that, or majority of the left that they call quote-unquote leftists, they didn't even support Kurdish movement, right? They even like acting as if they are enemies, because Kurdish movement means threat toward Turkish nationality or the unity, therefore left looking them as like others or enemies. And one more thing I want to say, the danger of the neoliberalism is that they change the meaning of the left and right. I heard from more than one person, and these people are educated, highly educated. They said, oh, I'm not from left, I'm not from right. I don't have to be. There's no such things anymore. Because neoliberalism means, it's like, I say what I want, and these people were in the street in Ankara. They didn't know what they want. I mean, just like once we were questioning the Wall Street movement, what do they really want? Okay, we gathered here, but they can't really take it to, like a big concept, or they can't see where this movement can lead to, because neoliberalism changed our understanding of left totally. As you said, what is imperialism? If you ask these questions, not only in Turkey but in around the globe, everyone will give a different response, and they will, or some may just fear that that's something like was in the past. It's like no longer exists. Just like left, that's there's no left, no right. So that's, I believe, very big danger that neoliberalism, and Turkey is practicing neoliberalism, as we know for some time now. So.
One thing about Kurds, I think, I mean, in Turkey, left, I guess, is mainly like composed of the Kurdish activists and some other, I mean, they could be from different like ethnic origins, but Kurdish movement in Turkey is the carrier of the left, basically. I mean,
Yeah, well, yes.
and not only like that you have this like huge, like population of Kurds, but also Kurdish activists are much more organized, and like in terms of like the practical reasons also, like if you're going to do a demonstration, if you have like Kurdish activists, you will have a better demonstration. You can organize like people more. In a sense, like the Kurds have developed this like actually culture of like culture of like opposition and culture of kind of like organizing, like the bigger movements and bigger like populations. So I think that's like that's an important thing about like the place of Kurds in in left. I mean, Turkey's left. I mean, also one more point about it. In Turkey, for instance, like big associations like for instance, like in Turkey, there's the Engineers and Architects Association, which is like like traditionally associated with the left ideologies, and even there, like you could see actually like this organization is like consists of many Kurdish activists, like, and they could actually like win the elections in the. I mean, they don't have to be like Kurdish nationalists, but I mean like people who have like some kind of like Kurdish, connection with the Kurdish movement, they could win elections in this like huge organization. So in a sense, like I don't want to like reduce the left in Turkey to the Kurdish question, but more than that, I think like the Kurdish activists like has been the carrier of the kind of like this leftist culture in Turkey to to universities, to like or to associations and organizations as well as unions. That's I think one thing. In a sense, actually, like the if you look at from that perspective, actually, the left who's supporting the Kurds, like is also like kind of has already been in like kind of like connected to the Kurdish cause in a sense.
Samara had gotten her chance to respond.
Oh, I was actually going to pose a question, but I can wait until others ask their questions, and then we can just run more conversation.
So we had in the back, you had your hand up before.
Me?
Yeah.
I didn't, but I'm curious about a lot of things. I may have moved myself on in a way. I find this panel to be quite interesting and did not know what I was coming to, and find the whole history of the developments in this region very interesting. And I thought that there was a discussion on Kenya and Somalia in a South Asian topic was quite interesting. I've not been to this area, but this is all part of the same geopolitical region, and I find that there are so many areas in India and other parts of that section that are in a tremendous movement and have had so many stages of left development. The tremendous revolutionary development of peoples in Iran prior to Khomeini, that was in the anti-Shah period, that was devastated, I'm sure is similar to the large number of left people who were destroyed in the struggle in Sri Lanka over the past 20 years. And I feel in many ways our American left needs to learn a lot more and be in solidarity as the economic integration from finance brings further development of the peasantry. There will be a lot more shifting of peasants into the large urban areas throughout this area. And I'd really like to have our New York left learn much more. I see that you're part of a South Asia Solidarity Initiative, and being someone who's active at the Breck Forum, we have been discussing how do we there get people to present on the development of a left historically in that region, which we have not really had much take place on, and I'd really like to see this happen more in our New York left culture. So I didn't make a question, I just made a statement, but before you end today, can you describe what the sponsoring group is.
Yeah. By the way, so before I get to the question, so the South Asia Solidarity Initiative, if you want to get involved, just come and talk to Neil or myself. You'll get your email. And we're actually teaching a course at the Brett Forum, which has been going on, and we'll probably repeat again, a 6-week-long course, which meets every Sunday, on rethinking South Asia from a left perspective.
I do know that, but I can't come on Sunday.
Go ahead.
My name is Bahar, and I just wanted to sorry I was late, so I missed the beginning of the discussion, but I'm wondering if we can discuss a little bit the differences between the left in more, in let's say the Western societies like the States versus the left in countries where there's the identity and ethnicity plays a huge role. We are talking about the Kurds, we're talking about countries like Kenya and Somalia where it's very diverse in terms of different ethnicities and the different sort of visions in terms of what they want. So for example, the Kurds are divided in 4 countries, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and if they're united, they may want to have their own country as opposed to just collaborating in Turkey so that the oppression of the government of Turkey is removed on them. So, and the same with Somalia and Kenya, different ethnicities, and the question of colonialism and how that has played a role, because the situation in America, let's say, is different. The left has a different context and different situation compared to these countries where there's a lot of identity issues playing a role in it. So how can we take that into consideration and in terms of showing solidarity, in terms of unifying the left and going forward?
So, just like this other fellow who spoke, I came here because this is an area I know very little about, and I thought, well, I might as well take an opportunity to learn something. And so 2 things occurred to me. One is just recently when the brother was speaking about Turkish left, and it being largely the culture of the left, and some of the politics being carried in the Kurdish movement, it occurred to me, not, I'm sure for the first time for others, the African American, the black movement in the 50s and the 60s played exactly that role. I mean, the American left was inconsiderable, to say the least, and the black movement, it's carried traditions of mass struggle, of organizing at the grassroots, of building alliances, but also defying state laws, and inspired the student movement, which led to the anti-war movement and the women's movement, the spring of the whole thing. It occurs to me that, your point about, not that there's an exact parallel, but that it's really the question of solidarity with movements of the oppressed is of critical importance. There wouldn't have been a left in the 60s without the black movement in the 50s and the early 60s. I have a question from the brother are you from Sri Lanka?
Yeah.
It sounded that way. So, I remember in the 70s I was more optimistic about the revolutionary socialism than I am currently, but you mentioned the Sinhalese youth movement, revolutionary youth movement, or it came across that way. And I remember being inspired by it. Is it true, my recollection, that the U.S., India, the U.S., China, and Russia all collaborated in the suppression of that? Could you elaborate a little bit? Because to me it was like a precursor, it's like a lightning flash of what's really happening in the world, as opposed to the Sino-Soviet and the U.S., China, and all that sort of stuff. I mean, the 3 of them collaborated to suppress it. So if you could elaborate a bit, it might be helpful.
Yeah. The question, Samar, I was not very clear on, you talked about the destruction of the coastline of Somalia. You didn't elaborate on it, so if you could just tell us a little more about that and piracy, because I thought it was a very good counter-narrative to piracy. So some more details on that.
I also have a follow-up question. I'm really interested in this idea of maritime piracy as one of the final interjections of the denizen against global capital. So I was wondering if you could explore some lessons or tactics that have been employed in Somalia and Kenya. And it sounds like what you've been saying is that the main reason or justification for international intervention has been the absence of the state. How exactly would, for example, how do you think the international community is going to justify intervention such as in like the Strait of Hormuz, where it's also such a strong geopolitical, it's of such geopolitical importance, and there have been instances of piracy as well. And since there is an active state agent there, is the same or similar narrative going to be used to justify intervention, or what are the similarities and what are the main distinctions between the two?
Let her start her change.
Well, maybe we'll just get all the comments from you.
Yeah, maybe in my simple mind, I see a certain consistency from one country to the other country, historically and contemporaneously. I think of Turkey, and I think of when I was growing up, that Turkey was a recipient of the Truman Doctrine and got its marching orders from the United States and became basically an anti-Soviet state. And basically that's what's happening, except on the edges. It's always been that way. An anti-left state, at least since the Second World War, and with allies. The Kurdish Workers' Party leader was arrested and sentenced to death. He wasn't killed, but he's in jail with the connivance of the capitalist countries. Kenya, Israel, the United States. It was almost like there were no borders. He was just sent right back to Turkey. And you think of Iran. I remember when I went to law school, there was a guy I was very friendly with who was from the Tudor party in Iran. And he couldn't go back. His parents they were middle class, they sent him money, so he lived in the United States. But when you go from country to country, whether it's even, let's say, Syria, it's not just happening, what's happening now. This is something that world capitalism decided is in their interests, and they're going to happen. And the details, although they intrigue us, are really not the important thing. The important thing is that Western capitalist countries have decided that they don't want Bashar in power, and it's in their interest not to have him in power. And that's what's happened in Tunisia, and that's what's happening in Egypt. It's all the same thread of world capitalism being very smart and very motivated, and making sure, to the extent that they control the situation, to make sure that it ends up regardless of how it started, and regardless of the language. These countries are in their pocket. And we have a tendency to get caught up in the minutiae, and that makes us think about things that of course we should always think, but the problem basically is the same, no matter what country you go to. I'm thinking, and I'll shut up in a second. I'm thinking of Indonesia. We didn't like Sukarno, so we gave them Suharto. We were very proud of it, the United States, the CIA. We killed 1 to 2 million people in Jakarta alone. They said the rivers ran with blood, were red with blood. It's the same thing. It's world capitalism led by here. All the other countries are really on the periphery. And that's what's happening, I think.
We don't have too much time, but maybe to articulate the larger vision that Ahilan wanted us to come up with at the beginning.
All right, I'll try to respond to a couple of the specific questions on Somalia first. The extent of the destruction off the coast, as I mentioned, that primarily what has been occurring is a combination of dumping of toxic waste and illegal fishing. And the Somalis have appealed to the UN Environmental Program for attention to that. There is actually a convention that exists to regulate the safe disposal of toxic waste, but of course that convention is unenforceable. But in particular, I mean, this problem, the toxic waste problem, is not just specific to that area. It is a phenomenon around the coast of Africa, around the continent of Africa. You had in 2006 dumping by a European firm of toxic waste off the coast of Cote d'Ivoire that they essentially negotiated with the Ivorian government a deal to do for maybe a tenth the cost that it would cost to do it properly in Europe. There is an Italian, what's known as kind of an Italian waste mafia that is engaged in that kind of behavior off the coast of Somalia. And again, it gets a bit blurry about how these deals are negotiated, if it's just done in the dark of the night or if they are actually working with some officials to do so. As far as the difference between the state of Hormuz, I mean, I think with what you have on the coast of East Africa is both the transitional federal government and the Kenyan government, who are effectively in the hands of the U.S., especially the Somali government having been installed by the Americans. So it's much easier to control the narrative itself and much easier to control what goes on in there.
Well, it is 1:50 now, so in the interest of letting people get to their next session, we'll let you go. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and thank our panelists.